things that I find concerning, which are kind of sort of trendy. I've seen an awful lot of cuts on students' arms, self harm, and the trends like the Tide Pod challenge that can be life threatening, and youngsters, they kind of get roped into these things. I mean, the blue whale challenge as well. I don't know if you've heard of that one, but this ended up in kids killing themselves over these challenges. Yeah, one lad served a 3-year sentence for enticing suicide, and I just wonder how it is that our youngsters get roped into these kind of these trends, and they're ultimately they're dangerous and could be life threatening.
Yeah. To that, I would say, like, we have an unfortunate combination with young people where developmentally their frontal lobe is not developed to the point where impulse control and consequential thinking is as developed. So as an adult, when we do look at these situations with our adult brains, we go, well, that's ridiculous. But from a teenager or a young person, they see themselves as invincible, that's happened to other people, but it's not going to happen to me because I'm special, or I'm smart enough that I will avoid that type of situation, or, well, it's just so rare that, statistically that's unlikely, although they don't think statistically, but they just go, oh, that's just a weird thing, that's the odd one. Combined with the influence of peer pressure, because your peer group is so important in this age bracket, that's a very toxic combination that does really set things up. So how do you then do that is really tricky, but often it'll be trying to give students a moment to just, like, how do you create 30 seconds for yourself, just to go, is this really what I want to be doing? It might be like, if they've got a good, strong relationship with their parents, then it might be about, like, would I be embarrassed to tell my dad about this tomorrow? And if I would, then it's probably not a great idea for me. And for others, it's, if they have, a slightly lower self-esteem, or it's that sense of belonging, then it's, who am I doing this for? Am I doing it because I genuinely am interested in doing this activity? Or am I doing it because these people expect me to? And so if I don't, what will then happen? So I'll engage that with some students. If you don't do it, what do you think the response is going to be? And they're like, oh, then they'll reject me. Okay, well, then what does that tell you about them as friends? Maybe they're not the best friends. Yeah, maybe. Or they go, oh, they'll make fun of me, but then they'll forget about it after like 10 minutes or the next day. You go, okay, so then maybe, whereas in your mind in that immediate moment is this idea of, oh, I'm going to be rejected, and it's we see the catastrophic possible outcome. Yeah. So there's that. Other kids, it might be like, if you're going to do this, how do you make sure you're being responsible about it? Where it's, and is this, so maybe kids, I'm trying to think of an appropriate example, because something like the Tide Bud thing, like, that's just not appropriate. And with that one, it might be just educating kids on, like, this is poison and you are ingesting poison. But it's often where they're getting that message from, because if they're being told by an authority figure, don't do this, then that's the one thing they're going to do, because that is a way to assert autonomy in the situation. So then you might be looking at, like, how do we get this messaging? And so then things like, and I hate like influencers and that type of thing, but is it their peers of some sort, whether it's the physical peers at school with them, or celebrities who they strongly identify with, or people on social media who they admire. If it's coming from them, is that going to be more meaningful? So thinking about the messenger. But then that other point around, like, maybe it's doing certain behaviors, and you might think that you can do this safely. So I might ask them to kind of walk me through how you're going to do this safely. And if you can't answer this question, then maybe it's because you can't do this safely, and what's the possible consequences if this goes wrong for you. Trouble is, doing that type of thing, it's not like we can all be there every time, be like, wait, think for a moment. So it's trying to I would say, like, sort of building up students' sense of self enough to the point where if I don't want to do something, then I feel comfortable saying no. Whereas I think some of this more reckless behavior, they're doing it because, like, long term, that might be bad for me, but short term, I'm part of the group, and our brain loves, like, immediate rewards, no matter how silly that is. It's the same with, oh, well, I could, if I exercise for an hour every day, then in 2 years' time, I'll be the weight that I want, but I could just eat some chips now and that'll be so much better. So we're all victim to that. So students aren't any different in that way. But it's having them to feel like, what are the short-term consequent, like, benefits for you to say that? Like, is it you're more clearly establishing who you are and what your values are? And if you maintain this message, it's like kids feeling pressured to drink, for example. And I definitely had that when I was younger, but it was, as long as I'm consistent in my message, eventually my friends got it and they were like, oh, Kieran just doesn't drink. And so then they stopped asking me or offering it to me. So if you're consistent with that, whereas if you do keep changing your mind, then your friends, it makes sense that they're going to keep asking you, because it's possible your decision is going to be different each time. But if you're being consistent with that, and so then with some kids, it's physically practicing how to say no, using language that they're comfortable with, and you want it to be to the point where it's a muscle memory, because if you're trying to exert a new skill when you're already in a stressful situation, you're probably not going to do a very good job, because the more you mentally prepare, there's a lot of research, like us visualizing a situation and seeing ourselves successfully getting through that trains the brain in a very similar way to actually being in that situation. So if we can, okay, let's say your friends are laughing at you because you say no. How would you feel at that point? Like, are you comfortable that, where it might not be very pleasant, but it's not this absolutely soul-destroying experience that maybe you're anticipating that it's going to be?
Do you ever come across copycat cases where has it become trendy to be suffering from anxiety or depression? Because as there's more awareness, we're getting over these taboos, do you ever feel that some cases are just fake?
That's a good question. So when I heard the term copycat, sometimes we think of that in the context of, like, suicides and suicide attempts. And there is research showing that, like, when a suicide is reported in the media, you do see a slight increase of suicides and in the suicide method that person used. So there's a lot of guidelines that the media outlets are given around how you responsibly report suicides. In regards to like, are other people sort of faking these other ones? I think sometimes it can be some of our mental health language can be hijacked, and people go, oh, I'm really OCD about this. And I have a client, she said, like, when people say that, and she has OCD, she goes, I get really annoyed when they use that because, and she didn't use these words, but for her, it was like, it's trivializing my experience. And then people don't take it seriously when I say that I have OCD. So I think sometimes people, or like, oh, I felt really depressed that my team lost yesterday. You go, well, you were very sad, but you probably weren't depressed. So it's helping people to kind of distinguish and really understand what these terms mean. But I guess, like, my approach would be, like, if that's what someone is the language that they're using, and that's what they're saying that they're feeling, I wouldn't go in with oh, like, is this really what's going on? Like, I think it's important that we believe kids when they say what they're saying, so that they feel validated. I think just getting that sense of validation is really important for anybody, that they feel heard. And then you can go into what sort of what is going on for that person overall, and then educating them around, you know, the stuff that you're describing kind of coincides with more of an anxiety disorder, and this is what we tend to see. But, you know, there's a lot of really good strategies to help overcome that. Here are all the different options available to you. Which one would you like to try? In terms of like this idea of, are people, I wouldn't say, you know, faking it, but there is the potential, I guess, for secondary gain that people can get when they take on that label of having a mental illness. And those secondary gains can be things like, oh, people are always really nice to me, or the teachers don't put as much pressure on me to do A, B, and C, or my mum is always going to step in whenever I'm feeling, or this is always, you know, this is the perfect excuse and no one ever really pushes back if I say that this is what's going on. And so then it can be, oh, well, if I start working on this and I don't have this, then yes, I'm going to lose some of the negative stuff, but I'm also going to lose some of this positive stuff. And I don't know if I want to do that. And some people, that aspect of themselves becomes a really crucial part of their identity. And it's educating the school or parents or the other people around them about potential secondary gain, and that, and saying, you know, I'm sure this is not the intent behind, you know, I'm sure you're trying to support your child as best as you think you can. But do you think it's having maybe an unintended consequence where they're not pushing themselves so hard because they know that you're going to step in for them? So how do we start to withdraw that, not in a way that's going to like have the child feel completely unsupported, and telling them like, we're doing this because you know, part of growth and overcoming this is pushing you outside of your comfort zone a little bit, so that we can develop these skills so that you feel capable of handling it, and motivating them that, yes, it might mean that you're uncomfortable for a period of time, but what do you think are going to be the benefits for you when you ultimately overcome this?
Final question, Kieran. What reactions might we get if we speak to someone who's suffering but might not necessarily want anyone to know that they're depressed? And how would we deal with that?
So if someone shared that with me, and I guess also from a legal perspective, you know, child protection laws, as well as just our ethical responsibilities of, if we think someone's physical safety is at risk, then that brings up issues around confidentiality, which gets very messy when it comes to young people, and different jurisdictions will have different rules depending on how old they are. But I guess if someone said like, this is what's going on for me and I don't want you to tell anybody, then it would be asking, why is that? What is it about the idea of telling someone that makes you uncomfortable, and exploring that with them? So you're worried about the person's reaction? Is it only certain people that you're worried about? Is it, you know, are you worried like that the way that they might interpret it? So if things were explained to them in a specific way, would you feel more comfortable with that? So helping them identify that for themselves, because sometimes they haven't really thought about that. Why? Well, I don't know, because their anxiety might kick in so much that they kind of, they move away from that thought. They go, let's just sit with it for a little bit. Like, what's the scenario that you build up in your head? And then it would be, you know, what would be our goal in sharing that with someone? Because we only would do that if we think it's going to be helpful. I think the last thing a student would want if it feels like I'm the teacher gossip at the moment, and everyone knowing isn't actually helping. It's just now everybody knows, and I feel really self-conscious about that. So it's often, you know, certain people maybe don't need to know, and it was, well, I would like to inform like the wellbeing officer, because then we can implement some support. So with our students, if they're asking for like mitigating circumstances, in consideration of like how things are going to be marked, I might tell them, it would be really helpful, to see the wellbeing officer, because then if you decide that you need to pursue this, then they can actually submit a report in support of your application. So, there's that practical element of like, this will help you, as well as, this person could be, this is what they're here to do. This is what we pay them to deal with these types of situations. So they're really well trained, because some kids it might be, I don't think this person is really going to know how to deal with this. I've had some students where they've had a really bad experience when they have shared it. And so they're very scared that a similar situation is going to come up. And so then it's sort of normalizing that and going, yeah, that sounds really awful, and I'm really sorry you had to go through that. What I can say is like, this person's really well trained and I've worked with them before, and they're very comfortable and very knowledgeable of this type of area. So it shouldn't be that decisions are being made around this person and they become this passive observer of how everybody else is dealing with their own difficulties. But it's keeping them as informed as we think is appropriate, because sometimes developmentally that might not be possible for us to do. But that they understand, again, that like comes back to what I was saying right at the start, which is a nice circle, that every decision that we're doing is with your safety and your well-being as the primary consideration. It might feel like we're kind of punishing you, and that must feel really awful if it feels like that to you, but that's certainly not the intent. But it's us as a team working together so that you can recover from this, as I know you can, and then like building up your other skills, and we can start to reduce some of these other things. But I sometimes use the analogy of, think of it as like you have broken a leg at this point. You're going through a crisis. And if someone's broken their leg, I don't tell them, too bad, you have to crawl. I'm going to go, okay, like we're going to put a cast on your leg. I'm going to give you a crutch or a wheelchair. The school will give you access, to the building from certain points. So each, I am your cast. This other person is your crutch. This other person is your wheelchair. And as your strength build up and your leg starts to recover, these things, these additional supports start to get taken away. I know we haven't really talked about stigma, but that's the other factor, because if you're so, if your peer group and your identity is still being formed and who you are, and then you're dealing with this on top of that, like how are people going to react if they know that this is what I am going through? So I may not feel safe sharing that with people because I'm worried about getting rejected as a consequence. It's really hard.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Karen, for sharing your time and expertise. It was a real pleasure having you.
Yeah.
Okay.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.